In the lush green fields of England, Longbourn House stands with its blend of grandeur and simplicity among towering trees. The Bennet family has 5 unmarried daughters: Jane, Elizabeth, Mary, Kitty, and Lydia, all of whom are of marriageable age. Mrs. Bennet fears that her daughters may never find husbands. As Mrs. Bennet anxiously paces the drawing room, someone knocks on the door. The door opens, and Mrs. Lucas enters excitedly. Wonderful news! A wealthy young man named Bingley has rented Netherfield Park. Mrs. Bennet exclaims with excitement. A single man with such wealth? Surely he must need a wife. Meanwhile, Elizabeth, the second daughter, glances at her older sister, Jane, whose cheeks have slightly flushed. Mrs. Bennet eagerly begins planning how to introduce her daughters, while Elizabeth, with a curious smile, thinks about the fire that is soon to ignite. Because of Mr. Bingley's arrival at Netherfield Park, the noble and respectable families arranged a grand ball. The night of the ball arrived, and the Bennet family, dressed in elegant attire, entered the hall. Jane, beautiful and charming, immediately caught Mr. Bingley's attention. Bingley, a kind and warm-hearted man, eagerly invited her to dance. Jane, with a gentle smile, accepted his invitation. Meanwhile, Elizabeth noticed a man standing in the corner of the ballroom, Mr. Darcy, Bingley's close friend, a tall, handsome man, yet cold and proud. Unintentionally, Elizabeth overheard a conversation. One of the guests suggested that Darcy should dance with Elizabeth, but Darcy gave her a brief glance and indifferently refused. Elizabeth, her pride wounded, turned away. A spark of anger and contempt ignited in her heart. The first sign of enmity between her and Darcy was kindled on this memorable night. A few days later, a regiment was stationed in the nearby town of Meriden. The townspeople's attention quickly turned to the well-dressed officers. The Bennet family also went to town for shopping, and there, Elizabeth met Mr. Wickham for the first time. An officer, Mr. Denny, a friend of the Bennet family, introduced Wickham to her. Elizabeth and Mr. Wickham engaged in conversation. Wickham, polite and witty, carried the conversation smoothly, and very soon, Elizabeth found herself enjoying his pleasant and charming demeanor. But a moment later, across the street, Mr. Darcy appeared. His eyes briefly landed on Wickham, and suddenly his expression darkened. Wickham, too, upon seeing Darcy, quickly looked away. Elizabeth noticed these sudden changes. Wickham then spoke, explaining his reaction. Darcy and I have known each other since childhood. His father cared for me like a son and promised me an inheritance. But after his death, Darcy broke his word and deprived me of everything. Now, I am forced to serve in the army just to make a living. Elizabeth, already displeased with Darcy, believed Wickham's words and returned home. Days pass, and the relationship between Jane and Mr. Bingley grows closer. Everyone expects that a proposal will happen soon. But suddenly, everything changes. Bingley leaves for London without any explanation. He does not send any letters or messages to Jane, leaving her heartbroken and devastated. One day, at a gathering, Elizabeth encounters Bingley's sister. From their conversation, she realizes that Darcy and the Bingley family have convinced Bingley that Jane does not truly love him and that marrying her would be unwise. Elizabeth's anger and resentment toward Darcy deepen even further. That night, she thinks to herself that if she ever gets the chance, she will reproach Darcy for what he has done. A few weeks later, Elizabeth travels with her aunt and uncle to the Pemberley region. By chance, they decide to visit Darcy's grand estate, assuming he is not at home at the time. Elizabeth is astonished by the beauty and magnificence of Pemberley. But more than anything, the words of the servants about Darcy's kindness and generosity make her pause. How could someone who seemed so cold and arrogant be so respected and beloved by those around him? Suddenly, Darcy arrives. Unlike before, his demeanor is warmer and more courteous. He speaks to Elizabeth with respect. The most unexpected event occurs a few days later when Darcy boldly visits Elizabeth. Though visibly anxious, he finally confesses. Despite all the differences in our social standing and the obstacles between us, I have fallen in love with you from the depths of my heart. Elizabeth looks at him with eyes full of anger and disdain and replies, "How can you expect me to accept your proposal when you destroyed my sister's life?" For a moment, Darcy remains silent. His eyes, once filled with pride, now show something akin to sorrow and regret. But he says nothing. He simply lowers his head and leaves the room. Elizabeth lets out a sigh of relief. Yet deep inside, she feels turmoil. The next morning, Elizabeth receives a letter from Darcy. At first, she hesitates to open it, but curiosity gets the better of her. In the letter, Darcy explains that his intention in separating Jane and Bingley was to protect them, as he genuinely believed that Jane's feelings were not sincere. But that was not the whole story. He goes on to reveal that Wickham had not only received an inheritance from Darcy's family, but had squandered all on gambling and debauchery. When he had no means left to support himself, he deceitfully sought out Darcy's younger sister, Georgiana, attempting to seduce her and elope solely to gain access to her wealth. Elizabeth reads the letter over and over again. How could she have been so easily deceived by Wickham's charm? Not long after, a disastrous piece of news arrives. Lydia, Elizabeth's youngest sister, has run away with Wickham. The news strikes the Bennett family like an earthquake. Their entire reputation is now at stake. Mr. Bennett immediately sets out to find them, but there is no trace of Lydia and Wickham. Mrs. Bennet falls into despair, bedridden with distress, while Jane does her best to comfort her. Elizabeth is consumed by guilt. If only she had warned her sister earlier, this might never have happened. In the depths of her despair, Elizabeth unexpectedly encounters Darcy. With shame, she tells him about Lydia's situation. But to her surprise, Darcy does not look down on her. Instead, he tries to reassure her. A few days later, an astonishing piece of news arrives. Lydia and Wickham are married. But how? Mrs. Bennet is delighted to hear the news of Lydia and Wickham's marriage. When Lydia returns home, she speaks with pride and excitement about Wickham and their wedding. She says, "Without the help of that wealthy man, we could never have married." Elizabeth asks Lydia what she means. Lydia reveals that it was Darcy who helped them. He found Wickham, paid off his debts, and arranged for them to be married. Elizabeth wonders why Darcy would do such a thing. For the first time, Elizabeth's pride is shattered. She can no longer see Darcy as merely an arrogant and conceited man. Now, she sees a man who, in silence and without expecting any reward, has made sacrifices for her family. Some time passes, and Jane is still heartbroken because Bingley left her without any explanation. But suddenly, news arrives, Mr. Bingley has returned to Netherfield. Mrs. Bennet immediately prepares everyone for a visit. When Bingley comes to their house again, Jane sees him with a trembling heart but a calm face. This time, Bingley, though shy, looks at Jane with eyes full of love and asks for her hand in marriage. With a smile, Jane accepts. Elizabeth, watching this scene, suddenly notices that Darcy has come with Bingley. She realizes that it was Darcy who convinced Bingley to correct his past mistake. She can no longer deny that she had misjudged Darcy, and this realization makes her heart tremble. A few days later, Elizabeth is walking through the fields around Longbourn. Suddenly, Darcy appears in the distance. The two stand in silence for a moment, looking at each other. Darcy tells Elizabeth that if her feelings for him are still the same, he will say nothing more and leave. But Elizabeth replies that her feelings have changed. And in that quiet, magical moment, the story of Pride and Prejudice reaches a place no one could have imagined.